They say the old Stillwater plantation had its own kind of nightmare, one led by Colonel Dayton, a man who hunted enslaved people the way other men hunted deer. He called it sport. The folks who survived called it hell. But one night, the colonel made a choice he thought would make him a legend. He picked a new target, Moses Warwick, a quiet giant standing 7'3", a man who never bragged, never fought, but carried storms behind his eyes. At first, people whispered he didn't stand a chance. Then the woods went silent, trackers vanished, and the colonel's proud stride came back broken. His leg snapped by the very trap meant for the giant. That was the moment the legend began, when the hunter realized he wasn't the only one who knew the rules of the game. And from that night on, the question spread through every cabin in Cotton Row. If the colonel made the wrong man his prey, what happens when the prey decides the hunt ends on his terms? Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The moon hung fat and white over Stillwater Plantation, turning the Spanish moss into ghostly curtains between the pines. Colonel Tobias Dayton sat straight-backed on his stallion, Winchester rifle balanced across his lap, his silver-streaked beard catching the lantern light like frost. Behind him, 3 mounted hunters waited, wealthy men from neighboring estates, invited to witness what the colonel called the gentleman's trial. A proper hunt refines a man's character, the colonel said, his voice smooth as aged bourbon. These woods demand discipline, strategy, the kind of virtue that built the South. The dogs bayed somewhere ahead, their voices rising and falling like a terrible choir. One of the hunters, a portly man named Caldwell, shifted in his saddle. "How long has she been running?" Caldwell asked. 37 minutes, the colonel said, checking his pocket watch. She should have lasted no more than 20. The woman's name was Lydia Moore. She was 19 years old. She ran barefoot through the undergrowth, her simple cotton dress torn at the hem, her breath coming in ragged gasps that burned her throat. Blood seeped from a gash across her left foot where broken glass had cut deep. Every step sent fire through her leg. Behind her, the dogs grew louder. She had tried to escape before, twice. The first time, they had caught her within hours. The second time, she had made it 3 days before the patrollers brought her back in chains. Each time, the punishment had been worse. But when she learned the colonel had purchased her specifically for his hunt, she knew there would be no third capture. Only death in these woods, or death at his hands. The trees pressed close around her. Moonlight struggled through the canopy, creating patches of silver and absolute black. Lydia's foot caught on a root, and she stumbled, catching herself against a pine trunk. The bark scraped her palms. "This way," one of the hunters called. "I heard something." Lydia pressed herself flat behind a massive fallen oak, its trunk nearly as tall as she was. The wood was soft with rot, damp against her cheek. She forced herself to breathe slowly, quietly, though her lungs screamed for air. Hoofbeats approached, the jingle of spurs. The colonel's lantern swept across the forest floor, its yellow light painting the dead leaves and exposed roots. The beam passed within 2 feet of where she crouched. "Perhaps she's already bleeding out somewhere," another hunter suggested. "No," the colonel said. "I wounded a doe once, tracked her for 3 hours. She had more fight than expected." He paused. "This one has spirit. I can feel it." Lydia squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself invisible. Her heart hammered so hard she thought they must hear it. The lantern light moved away, then swept back, slower this time. The colonel was being methodical. A branch lay directly in front of her hiding spot. If she moved even slightly, her knee would knock it against the oak trunk. The sound would give her away instantly. But as the lantern came closer again, the branch disappeared, simply lifted away without a sound. Lydia's eyes flew open. She saw nothing, just darkness and the retreating glow of the colonel's lantern. "She couldn't have gone far," the colonel said, frustration creeping into his refined accent. "A woman, injured, in the dark. She should have been easy prey." Lydia felt tears on her cheeks. She had run so far, tried so hard, and still they hunted her like an animal for their entertainment. Something touched her shoulder. A hand, massive and warm, so large it covered from her collarbone to her upper arm. She nearly screamed, but the hand gently, insistently, pushed her toward the left, toward a gap between two trees she had not seen in the darkness. She looked back, saw nothing but shadow. The hand pushed again, guiding her to her feet, directing her toward a narrow ravine that cut between the roots of an ancient cypress. Lydia did not understand, but she moved. The hand fell away. Behind her, the colonel raised his rifle. "There!" Lydia's dress had caught a beam of moonlight as she moved toward the ravine. The colonel fired, a warning shot that cracked through the night and sent birds shrieking from their roosts. The bullet struck a tree trunk 10 feet above Lydia's head. Then something flew from the darkness, a stone the size of a fist. It hit the colonel's lantern with perfect precision, shattering the glass. Hot oil sprayed across the ground, and the light died instantly. The colonel's stallion reared, eyes rolling white. Caldwell's horse bucked sideways into another hunter's mount. The animals had caught the scent of something that terrified them, something large, something close. "Control your horses!" the colonel shouted, fighting his own spooked animal. But the damage was done. In the chaos of panicking animals and shouting men, the moment was lost. The colonel stood in his stirrups, peering into the blackness where his lantern had shone. He saw nothing, heard nothing, but he felt the humiliation settling into his bones like winter cold. "We return to the house," he said, voice tight with controlled rage. "Now." "But, sir," Caldwell began. "Now." Lydia ran. Through the ravine, along a path that seemed to open before her in the darkness, past twisted roots and over stones that somehow did not trip her bleeding feet. She ran until her legs gave out, and she collapsed behind a gnarled tree at the very edge of the slave quarters. Dawn was coming. The sky had turned from black to deep blue. Lydia pressed her forehead against the bark and wept silently, her whole body shaking. A shadow fell across her, impossibly tall, impossibly broad. Lydia looked up and up and up. The man stood 7 feet and 3 inches, with shoulders wide as a door frame and hands that could palm her head like a child's ball. His face was kind, despite its severity. He wore the rough clothes of field labor, but carried himself like no slave she had ever seen. Moses Warwick knelt slowly, bringing his face level with hers. When he spoke, his voice was quiet as falling snow. "Are you safe?" Lydia nodded, unable to form words. Moses extended one massive hand. "Let me help you stand. Dawn's coming. You need to be inside before the overseer makes his rounds." She took his hand. It was warm and steady. He lifted her to her feet as easily as picking up a fallen leaf. The slave quarters came alive with the first light. Wooden doors creaked open. Women emerged carrying water buckets. Men stretched stiff backs after too short sleep on hard floors. Children huddled close to their mothers, quiet as ghosts. Lydia sat on an overturned crate outside the women's cabin, her injured foot soaking in a basin of cool water mixed with crushed herbs. An older woman named Clara had cleaned the wound and wrapped it in strips of clean cloth torn from her own spare dress. The cut was deep, but it would heal. Moses stood nearby, his height making him visible from every corner of the quarters. In full daylight, he was even more striking than Lydia had first realized. His skin was dark as walnut wood, smooth across his broad face. His shoulders stretched the seams of his work shirt. His hands, resting calmly at his sides, were the size of dinner plates, but it was his eyes that drew attention. Steady, measuring, kind. Eyes that had seen terrible things but had not gone hard. "You the new field hand?" Clara asked, studying Moses with the same careful assessment she might give a horse of uncertain temperament. "Came in 2 days ago?" "Yes, ma'am," Moses said. His voice was deep but soft, like distant thunder. Moses Warwick. Word spread through the quarters faster than fire through dry grass. By the time the sun cleared the tree line, every enslaved person at Stillwater knew that someone had interfered in the colonel's hunt, that Lydia had survived, that the new man, the impossibly tall one, had been in the woods last night. An old woman emerged from the cabin at the far end of the quarters. She moved slowly, leaning on a carved walking stick, but her back was straight and her eyes sharp. This was Mama Rue, the spiritual guide and healer who had buried more people than she cared to count, who had delivered babies and closed the eyes of the dying, who held the community together with prayer and wisdom and fierce, quiet love. She approached Moses directly, studying him with an intensity that made others step back. Moses met her gaze without flinching. "You got the look," Mama Rue said after a long moment. "What look is that?" Moses asked. "The look of a man sent for a purpose." She touched his arm, her small hand barely spanning a fraction of his forearm. "Don't know what that purpose is yet, but I feel it in my bones." Before Moses could respond, the sound of hoofbeats shattered the morning calm. Children scattered. Adults froze. The overseer would normally be making rounds by now, but this was different. This was the colonel himself. Tobias Dayton rode into the quarters on his black stallion, rifle across his saddle, face tight with barely controlled fury. His left hand was bandaged where hot oil from the shattered lantern had burned him. Behind him rode Caldwell and one other hunter from last night, both looking uncomfortable in the harsh morning light. "Line up," the colonel said. His cultured voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Every one of you. Now!" They lined up. Old Mama Rue, young mothers with babies on their hips, field hands still exhausted from yesterday's labor, children pressing close to their parents. Moses stood at the end of the line. Impossible to miss. The colonel rode slowly along the row, examining each face. When he reached Moses, he stopped. The stallion shifted nervously, sensing its rider's tension. The colonel stared up at Moses, and up, and up. Even mounted on horseback, he had to tilt his head back to meet the giant's eyes. "You're new," the colonel said. "Yes, sir," Moses replied. "From the auction in Savannah. 2 weeks ago." The colonel's memory of that day was vivid. He had been shopping for field labor when word spread through the auction house about the exceptional specimen on the main block. The auctioneer had called Moses a prime buck, 7'3", strong as 3 men combined. Stories had circulated. Moses had lifted a toppled wagon off a trapped child in South Carolina, had carried 2 injured men 3 miles through swampland to safety, had never shown violence, but possessed strength that defied reason. The colonel had bid aggressively, paying nearly twice the going rate, already imagining the possibilities. Not for field work, never just field work, for something far more entertaining. "Someone interfered in my hunt last night," the colonel said, his gaze never leaving Moses's face. "Someone with unusual strength, someone who knew those woods in the dark." Moses said nothing. "Do you know anything about that?" the colonel pressed. "No, sir," Moses said calmly. "I'm new here. Don't know the woods yet." It was not quite a lie. Moses did not know these specific woods, but he had grown up in the pine forests of South Carolina, had learned to read terrain like other men read books, could move through darkness like smoke through air. The woods behind Stillwater were different in detail but identical in essence. Every forest spoke the same language if you knew how to listen. The colonel smiled slowly. It was not a pleasant expression. "You're perfect," he said, almost to himself. "Yes, absolutely perfect." He addressed the assembled crowd, raising his voice. "In 3 days, I will host another gentleman's trial. The quarry will be this one." He gestured toward Moses. "My guests have expressed great interest in witnessing a truly challenging hunt." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mama Ru's grip tightened on her walking stick. Lydia, still sitting with her foot in the basin, went pale. 3 days, the colonel repeated. "I suggest you use that time to familiarize yourself with the property." He leaned forward in his saddle, speaking directly to Moses now. "Run well, boy. Make it sporting. The better the chase, the more merciful I might feel toward the others here." The threat was clear. Moses's performance would determine how the colonel treated the rest of the enslaved community. Fight well, and perhaps the colonel would be satisfied. Die without entertainment, and everyone would suffer. Moses met the colonel's eyes without fear. "Yes, sir." The colonel rode away, his companions following. The quarters remained silent for a long moment, after the hoofbeats faded. Then everyone began talking at once, voices mixing in a stew of fear and anger and desperate speculation. Moses spent the rest of the morning in the fields, but his eyes never stopped moving. He noted the tree line where the woods began, the way the land sloped toward a distant marsh, the paths worn by deer and rabbits, the patterns of bird flight that indicated water sources. By midday, he had mapped the terrain in his mind with the precision of a surveyor. That evening, the quarters gathered for their meager dinner: cornmeal mush, salt pork so thin you could see through it, water from the well. Moses sat with a group of men and women in the common area between cabins. Mama Ru sat nearby, listening. "They going to kill you?" An older man named Samuel said bluntly. "That's what the colonel does. Hunts us for sport. You can't outrun horses and guns." "I don't plan to outrun them," Moses said quietly. Everyone leaned closer. "The colonel wants a hunt," Moses continued. "Let him have one. But while his attention is on me in those woods, while every overseer and slave catcher is watching the trees, the paths north will be clear." He looked around the circle. 3 families, maybe 4, could move during the hunt. Reach the first safe house before anyone notices they're gone. "That's madness," Clara whispered. "If they catch people running during a hunt, the punishment is already coming," Lydia said softly. She had limped over to join them. "The colonel is angry, embarrassed. He'll take it out on someone eventually. Might as well make it count for something." They debated quietly as darkness fell. The danger was immense, but so was the opportunity. The colonel would be distracted. The overseers would be watching the hunt. For a few hours, the plantation's grip would loosen just slightly. By the time the quarter bells rang for sleep, a plan was forming. Fragile, desperate, but possible. That night, as the cabins fell silent and the guards made their rounds, Moses stood alone outside, staring into the dark line of trees where the hunt would take place. The moon was waning now, giving less light than last night. That was good. Darkness was a weapon if you knew how to use it. The morning air carried a festival atmosphere that made Moses's stomach turn. Carriages rolled up the long drive to Stillwater's main house, each one carrying plantation owners and their families from neighboring estates. Women in silk dresses, men in tailored hunting jackets, children eating sweet cakes and pointing at the slave quarters like they were viewing animals at a menagerie. Moses stood in the yard outside the quarters, flanked by 2 overseers with rifles. He wore the same rough cotton shirt and pants he'd worn for 3 days. Nothing more. No shoes, no provisions. The colonel wanted this to look like a traditional hunt, the way his grandfather had conducted them, the way the old stories described. Mama Ru had prayed over him before dawn. Lydia had pressed a small stone into his palm, smooth from the creek, something to hold on to. Samuel and the others had said quiet goodbyes, their faces tight with fear and desperate hope. The families chosen for potential freedom, the Thompsons, the Gales, and Lydia's small group of 3, waited in their cabin, not daring to believe the colonel's promise, but unable to ignore the possibility. Colonel Tobias Dayton emerged from the main house at mid-morning, walking with exaggerated confidence despite the bandaged hand and the limp from where his horse had stepped on his foot during the panicked retreat 3 nights ago. He had dressed for the occasion in a burgundy hunting jacket with gold buttons, polished boots, and a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in shadow. His rifle gleamed in the sunlight, freshly oiled and loaded. Behind him came his guests, Caldwell from the adjacent property, Judge Harrison from 2 counties over, a cluster of younger men eager to witness the famous gentleman's trial. Their horses were ready, their weapons prepared, their faces bright with anticipation. The colonel raised his hand, and the crowd quieted. Even the children stopped their chatter. "Friends," the colonel began, his voice carrying across the yard, "you honor me with your presence today. What you will witness is not mere sport, but the preservation of order, the maintenance of discipline, the demonstration that no matter how strong, how clever, how defiant a creature may be, civilization always prevails." Murmurs of approval rippled through the white onlookers. Some of the enslaved people watching from the quarters dropped their gazes. Others, like Mama Rue, kept their eyes fixed on Moses. The colonel gestured toward Moses. "This specimen represents the finest physical example I have ever purchased. 7 feet 3 inches. Strength beyond measure. Intelligence, I am told, that matches his size." He paused, letting the words settle. "Today, we test him. If he can evade my hunt for 1 full hour, 60 minutes by pocket watch, I will grant freedom to 3 families of his choosing via legally signed papers." He pulled documents from his jacket pocket, waving them for all to see. The Thompsons, the Gales, and the girl Lydia's group, all of them freed. On my honor as a gentleman. Everyone knew the colonel's honor was worthless. He had made promises before, always finding reasons to break them later. Legal technicalities, accusations of theft, claims of attempted escape. His word meant nothing except in the moment it served his purposes. But Moses nodded slowly. "I understand the terms." "Good," the colonel said. He consulted his pocket watch, a gold piece that caught the sunlight. "You will be given a 10-minute head start. When I fire this pistol into the air, you run. When I fire it again, the hunt begins. Understood?" "Yes, sir." The colonel raised his pistol skyward and fired. The crack split the morning. Birds exploded from nearby trees. Moses turned and ran toward the woods. He moved fast for a man his size, long strides eating ground, but he did not sprint. He needed to conserve energy, needed to think. The moment the trees swallowed him, he began his real work. Instead of running deep into the forest, Moses circled east, using a fallen pine to mask his footprints. The massive trunk had come down during last winter's ice storm, creating a natural bridge. Moses walked its length, stepped onto a rocky outcrop where prints wouldn't show, then moved parallel to the wood's edge about 40 yards in. He found a hickory with low-slung branches thick enough to hold his weight. Climbing carefully, he positioned himself 15 feet up, hidden by summer foliage, able to see the forest floor below. The second pistol shot echoed. The hunt had begun. Within minutes, Moses heard them. Horses crashing through underbrush, dogs baying, the colonel's voice calling orders. They followed his initial trail, the one he'd left deliberately obvious, heading straight into the deeper woods. Moses waited, patient, still. A 7'3" man, somehow invisible among the leaves. The hunting party split up. Caldwell and 2 others went north. Judge Harrison and his group went south. The colonel, determined to prove his superiority, pressed forward alone on horseback, following what he thought was Moses's path. Pride, the colonel's greatest weakness. Moses descended from the tree when the sounds faded. He moved through the forest like smoke, using deer trails, stepping on exposed roots to avoid leaving marks. He had spent 3 days studying this terrain, learning its rhythms, understanding its secrets. He climbed a ridge overlooking a narrow ravine. Below, the colonel rode slowly, scanning the ground for signs. Moses watched him from above, a predator observing prey. The trap waited 50 yards ahead. Moses had built it over 2 nights, sneaking from the quarters when the guards changed shifts. He'd found old shackles in a forgotten shed, the kind used for field punishment, rusted but still strong. He'd repurposed them into a snare, using tensioned branches and a trigger mechanism he'd learned as a boy in South Carolina. The trap sat hidden beneath leaves and pine needles, waiting for the right weight to trigger it. The colonel's horse moved toward it. Closer, closer. Moses had positioned everything perfectly. A fallen log that would force the horse to step left. Broken branches arranged to create a natural-looking path. The trap sitting in the only clear space wide enough for a mounted rider. The horse's hoof touched the trigger. The snare exploded upward with vicious force. Tensioned branches released. The shackle chain whipped tight around the horse's foreleg. The animal screamed and reared. The colonel, caught completely off guard, tumbled backward from the saddle. The sound of his leg breaking was audible even from the ridge, a wet crack like green wood splitting. The colonel's scream followed immediately after, high and agonized, all pretense of gentlemanly composure shattered. The horse bolted, dragging the snare mechanism but leaving the colonel crumpled on the ground, clutching his leg. Bone showed white through torn fabric. Blood darkened the earth beneath him. Moses descended the ridge silently. He approached the colonel from behind, moving through the trees until he stood directly over the fallen man. The colonel saw his shadow first, looked up. His face went from red to white. Moses towered over him, blocking out the sun, silent and enormous and terrifying in his calm. He knelt slowly, bringing his face level with the colonel's. "This ends when you end it," Moses whispered. The colonel's mouth worked soundlessly. Pain and shock and rage and fear all fought for dominance in his expression. Moses stood and stepped back into the trees. Within minutes, the other hunters found the colonel. Their shouts echoed through the woods. They fashioned a makeshift stretcher from branches and jackets, hauling their screaming host back toward the main house. Moses watched from deep in the trees as they carried the colonel across the yard, watched as the crowd of spectators recoiled from the blood and the screaming, watched as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. The hunt had lasted 37 minutes. The colonel's screams carried through the mansion's tall windows and across the manicured grounds where flowers grew in careful rows. His hunting party hauled him up the front steps like a wounded animal, his broken leg dragging at an unnatural angle, white bone visible through torn fabric and dried blood. "Get Hawthorne!" someone shouted. "Someone ride for Doctor." "Hawthorne, now!" Inside the grand entrance hall, they laid him on the imported Turkish rug his wife had ordered from Charleston 3 years before her death. The colonel thrashed and bellowed, his face purple with agony and rage. His carefully waxed mustache was streaked with dirt and sweat. The burgundy hunting jacket, so pristine hours earlier, hung torn and filthy. "That creature!" the colonel gasped between screams. "That monster set a trap. He turned my own hunt against me. Get him! Kill him! Bring me his head." Judge Harrison, still mounted outside, called through the open doorway. "Tobias, we need to discuss this rationally." "Rational?" The colonel's laugh came out strangled. "He humiliated me in front of half the county. There is nothing rational left." Dr. Hawthorne arrived within the hour. riding hard from his practice in town. He was a thin man in his late 40s with careful hands and eyes that had seen too much cruelty to register shock anymore. He'd been educated up north before circumstances, debts, and a failed engagement had brought him back south where his skills made him valuable to the plantation class. He examined the colonel's leg with clinical detachment while two men held their employer down. The fibula is shattered. Tibia fractured but not completely broken. I'll need to reset it immediately, or you risk permanent damage. Do it, the colonel hissed through gritted teeth. What followed made even the hardened hunters turn away. Dr. Hawthorne pulled the leg straight with steady force, while the colonel's screams reached new heights. The physician worked quickly, his movements practiced and efficient, setting the bone and wrapping it tight with splints and bandages. He administered laudanum afterward, enough to dull the worst of the pain, but not enough to quiet the colonel's fury. "You'll need to stay off this leg for at least 6 weeks," Dr. Hawthorne said, wiping blood from his hands. "Possibly longer. Any weight on it now could cripple you permanently." 6 weeks. The colonel's voice had gone quiet, which somehow seemed more dangerous than his screaming. 6 weeks, while that giant walks free on my property. By sunset, carriages had arrived from neighboring estates. Word of the colonel's injury had spread quickly through the network of plantation owners who saw any challenge to their authority as a threat to them all. They gathered in the colonel's study, expensive bourbon poured into crystal glasses, cigars lit, voices low and serious. Caldwell spoke first. "We should hang him tonight. Make an example. Show every slave in the county what happens to resistance." "No." The colonel sat in a leather chair, his splinted leg propped on an ottoman, his eyes bright with laudanum and something harder underneath. "Hanging is too quick, too simple. It makes him a martyr." "Then what do you propose?" Judge Harrison asked. The colonel leaned forward despite the pain it caused. "I propose we turn this into something larger, a grand hunt. We offer a bounty, substantial rewards for whoever brings Moses Warwick back alive. We invite hunters from across the region, professional slave catchers, trackers, anyone who wants to prove their skill. We make this a spectacle that will be remembered for generations." The room went quiet as the men absorbed this. "You're talking about significant money," Caldwell said slowly. "How substantial?" $500 for his capture. Another $500 for documentation of his humiliation. We hold a public trial. We break him properly. We show everyone, black and white, that no amount of strength or cunning can overcome the natural order. Judge Harrison set his glass down carefully. "That's $1,000, Tobias. That's more than most men earn in 5 years, and worth every penny to restore what he's stolen from me. My dignity, my authority, my reputation." The colonel's hands trembled slightly. "This isn't just about one escaped slave anymore. This is about every slave in the South seeing what happens when they forget their place." The men nodded slowly, understanding spreading among them. Fear of rebellion ran deep in their blood. Every successful escape, every act of defiance, threatened the entire system they'd built their wealth upon. "I'll contribute $200 toward the bounty," Caldwell said. "This concerns all of us. And I'll ensure the legal documentation is airtight," Judge Harrison added. "No technicalities for abolitionists to exploit later." By the time the meeting ended, the grand hunt had been formalized. Riders would carry word to neighboring counties by morning. Professional hunters would arrive within days. The largest manhunt the region had ever seen would descend upon Stillwater Plantation. Down in the slave quarters, word of the meeting spread through whispered conversations and terrified glances. The brief hope that had bloomed after Moses's victory in the woods withered quickly under the weight of new fear. Daniel Reed, a sturdy man in his 30s with carpenter's hands, found Moses behind the quarters, staring toward the woods. "They're planning something big, something worse than before." "I know," Moses said quietly. "We should run tonight, all of us, before they can organize. Run where? With children and elders? They'd catch us before we made 10 miles. Moses turned to face him. We have time. 3, maybe 4 days before outside hunters arrive. We use that time to prepare. Prepare how? Escape routes. Hidden paths through the marsh where horses can't follow. Food caches buried in waterproof containers. Teaching people to move quietly, to read the land, to trust each other. Over the next 2 days, Moses worked with quiet intensity. He identified narrow channels through the swamp where the water ran shallow enough to wade, but deep enough to confuse tracking dogs. He showed Daniel and others how to construct false trails, using deer scent and broken branches. He marked trees with subtle scratches that only those who knew what to look for could read. Lydia, recovered enough to move, despite the still healing cut on her foot, helped prepare food caches, dried meat wrapped in oilcloth, hardtack that wouldn't spoil, small amounts stolen from the main house kitchen without anyone noticing the losses. Mama Roo watched everything with worried eyes. She found Moses on the second evening, sitting outside her cabin, his massive frame folded into stillness. "You carry too much weight, son," she said softly. "Someone has to. The colonel's pride is more dangerous than any rifle he owns. Pride makes men do terrible things to prove they're still powerful. You broke more than his leg in those woods. You broke the image he built of himself. He won't stop until he rebuilds it, or dies trying." "I know." "Do you?" She sat beside him, her weathered hand touching his forearm. "Pride like his doesn't heal like bone. It festers. It grows infected. It poisons everything around it." Moses was silent for a long moment. "Then we prepare for the poison." That night, Daniel and young Saul, a quick teenager who'd been assigned to stable work, found Moses by the river that marked Stillwater's eastern boundary. The water ran black under the moon, smooth and quiet. "People are scared," Daniel said bluntly. "They're saying your plan will get us all killed, that we should just keep our heads down and survive like we always have." "And how long does that survival last?" Moses asked. "Another year? 10 years? How many more hunts does the colonel hold before someone else dies in those woods?" "At least we'd be alive to see those years," Saul said, his young voice tight with fear. "My mother's already been sold twice. I can't let her go through that again because of—" He stopped, unable to finish. "Because of me." Moses turned to face them both. "You think I don't know what I'm asking? You think I don't feel the weight of every person looking to me for answers I might not have? Then why do it?" Daniel demanded. "Why not just run yourself? You're big enough, strong enough, smart enough. You could make it north on your own." Moses looked at the water for a long moment before answering. "I had a younger brother once, back in Carolina, before I was sold the first time. His name was Isaac. He was 8 years old when the overseer beat him to death for spilling a bucket of water. 8 years old. I was 12, and I watched it happen. And I did nothing because I was afraid." The night sounds filled the silence. Crickets and tree frogs and the soft rush of the river. "I can't watch it happen again," Moses continued. "I can't stand by while the colonel hunts people for sport and breaks families apart and treats human beings like animals to be broken. Maybe running alone would save me, but it won't save anyone else. It won't change anything. And Isaac died for nothing if I spend the rest of my life saving only myself." Daniel's jaw worked silently. Saul stared at his feet. "I understand if you're afraid," Moses said. "I'm afraid too. But fear is only stronger than us if we face it alone. Together, if we trust each other, if we work as one, we have a chance. Maybe not a good chance, but a chance." The plantation rooster's crow cut through the morning mist, sharp and insistent. Moses had not slept. He stood near the edge of the quarters, watching the eastern sky lighten from black to deep blue, to the color of old bruises. His massive frame cast a long shadow across the packed dirt As the first hunters began arriving, they came in pairs and small groups throughout the morning. Professional slave catchers with scarred faces and cold eyes, men who tracked runaways for a living, and knew every trick desperate people used to disappear. Moses watched them from the cornfield where he'd been assigned to clear irrigation ditches, his movements slow and deliberate, while his eyes tracked everything. A tall man with a rifle slung across his back examined the wood's edge with the careful attention of someone reading a map. Two brothers from a plantation 30 miles south brought tracking dogs, lean, vicious animals that strained against their chains. An older hunter with gray in his beard set up camp near the main house, unpacking equipment with the patience of someone who understood hunts could last weeks. By midday, 8 hunters had arrived. By evening, there would be more. Moses finished his assigned work as the sun reached its peak, then moved through the quarters with quiet purpose. He found families gathered in small clusters, fear written across their faces like physical wounds. "The woods are our friend if we know how to use them," he told a group of women preparing the evening meal. "Trees grow thick on the north side, where moss catches moisture. If you're ever running at night with no moon, feel the bark. The rough side faces north. That's the direction of freedom." The women listened, some nodding, others too frightened to acknowledge they were hearing escape instructions. Moses showed the children how to move through underbrush without snapping twigs, how to test each step before putting weight down, how to become part of the forest instead of intruders within it. He made it seem like a game, and the children giggled while learning skills that might save their lives. "Step on the balls of your feet first," he demonstrated, his enormous body moving with surprising grace. "Let your weight settle slowly, like you're walking on thin ice that might crack." Young Saul proved a natural student, his teenager's coordination adapting quickly. "What about dogs?" he asked. "Water confuses scent. The marsh channels I showed Daniel, that's where you go if dogs are tracking. Wade through the deepest parts. The current carries your smell away downstream, sends the dogs in the wrong direction." At night, Moses taught navigation by stars. He gathered the elders outside Mama Ru's cabin, pointing up at the vast darkness scattered with light. "Find the drinking gourd in the sky," he said, tracing the Big Dipper's shape with one finger. "The 2 stars at the cup's edge. They point straight to the North Star. That star never moves. It marks true north, always. No matter how lost you are, that star leads to freedom." Old Turner stood at the back of the group, his weathered face troubled. His grandchildren, twin girls barely 6 years old, clung to his legs, and Moses saw the man's hands trembling as he touched their heads. The colonel's response to the growing preparation began subtly. Rations were cut by a third. Work hours extended into darkness. The overseer, a cruel man named Silas Bragg, walked through the quarters with a whip coiled at his belt, eyes searching for signs of rebellion. Then the beating started. A young man named Marcus was dragged to the whipping post for disrespectful eyes. 20 lashes administered with methodical brutality while everyone was forced to watch. The colonel sat in a chair brought from the mansion, his splinted legs stretched before him, watching with satisfaction. "Let this remind you all," the colonel announced afterward, "that mercy has limits. Cooperation will be rewarded. Defiance will be crushed." 2 days later, a woman named Sarah received 10 lashes for singing while she worked. The colonel claimed her song contained coded messages about escape. It didn't matter that the song was a spiritual her grandmother had taught her. The punishment served its purpose, spreading terror like disease through the quarters. Moses felt the community's fear growing heavier each day. Some people stopped meeting his eyes. Others whispered that his resistance would doom them all. Old Turner's fear for his grandchildren finally broke him. Moses discovered the betrayal on a cool evening when Daniel pulled him aside near the tool shed. "Someone's been talking to Silas," telling him where you've been hiding supplies, which paths you've been scouting. The overseer knew exactly where to find the food cache you buried near the oak grove. Everything was gone when I checked this morning. Moses said nothing, but his jaw tightened. It's old Turner, Daniel continued quietly. I saw him talking to Silas behind the stables yesterday. Saw Silas give him something. Looked like a scrap of salt pork. Moses found Turner that night, sitting alone behind the same tool shed where he'd passed information to the overseer. The old man's face crumpled when Moses approached, tears already streaming down his weathered cheeks. I'm sorry, Turner whispered. God forgive me. I'm sorry. But my grandbabies. They threatened my grandbabies. Said they'd sell the girls downriver where I'd never see them again if I didn't. His voice broke completely. Moses lowered himself to sit beside the old man, his massive frame somehow gentle in the movement. I know. You should hate me. You should. I know terror when I see it. Moses interrupted. Terror makes us do things we'd never choose freely. Makes us betray our own hearts to protect what little we have left. The Colonel understands that. He weaponizes it, turns our love for each other into chains stronger than any iron. Turner wept harder, his thin shoulders shaking. What did you tell them? Moses asked. About the northern cache, the dried meat buried near the lightning-struck pine. About the path you marked through the eastern marsh. Turner's voice was barely audible. I'm so sorry. Moses nodded slowly, his mind already working. The eastern marsh. You told them I use the wide channel where the water runs shallow? Yes. Good. That's perfect. Turner looked up, confused through his tears. That channel has quicksand along its southern edge, Moses explained. Looks like solid ground until you step on it. I've been planning to lead the hunters there eventually. Now you've given me reason to do it sooner. They'll send men to set an ambush where they think I cross. Instead, they'll be the ones trapped. You're not angry? I'm tired, Moses said honestly. Tired of a system that forces good men to betray each other for scraps and survival. But anger at you would be wasted. You're not my enemy. You never were. He stood, towering against the darkening sky. Keep feeding them information. Tell them I've been scouting the western woods now. There's a clearing where the ground looks firm, but sits above an old sinkhole. Let them set their trap there. Turner stared up at him, something between gratitude and anguish on his face. Why would you trust me after? Because you'll protect your granddaughters by giving them exactly what I tell you to give them. Because the Colonel thinks broken men stay broken. We'll show him different. Moses walked away into the gathering darkness, leaving old Turner weeping behind the tool shed. The old man's tears were for many things, shame and relief, and the terrible weight of living in a world where love itself could be weaponized against you. 2 days after his conversation with old Turner, Moses woke to changed air. The sky had turned the color of wet slate, heavy clouds pressing down like a lid over the world. Wind moved through the quarters with a restless energy that set doors creaking and made the old cabin timbers groan. Thunder rumbled in the distance, not the sharp crack of a nearby storm, but the deep rolling sound of something massive approaching from far away. Storm's coming hard, Mama Ruth said, emerging from her cabin to stand beside him. She tilted her head back, reading the clouds like other people read books. Big one. Be here before nightfall. Moses had been planning this move for days. The river would rise fast when the storm hit, making crossing impossible for at least a week afterward. But right now, in these few hours before the rain arrived, the water was still manageable, high enough to confuse tracking dogs, low enough to wade if you knew where to step. We moved the children today, he said. Before the storm closes the window. 8 children needed to cross, ranging from 12 years old down to 4. Their parents had agreed to the plan days ago, understanding that getting the youngest to safety across the river meant they'd be positioned for the next stage of escape when the time came. The children would stay hidden in a small cave system Moses had discovered on the northern bank, sheltered and dry, with food cached nearby. By mid-morning, they'd gathered at the meeting point in the woods. The children stood close to their parents, some crying silently, others trying to be brave. Moses knelt before them, making himself smaller, despite his enormous size. "You're going on an adventure," he told them gently. "Across the river to a secret place. I'll carry you. The water can't hurt you while I'm holding on." The youngest, a girl named Penny, reached up to touch his face. "You're really tall." "I am," Moses agreed, "which means I can walk through deep water while keeping you dry." The wind picked up as they made their way to the river. Leaves whipped through the air, and the thunder grew louder, no longer distant. The sky had darkened to the color of an old bruise. The river ran swift and brown, swollen from earlier rains upstream. Moses had spent yesterday morning setting up a rope line. A thick hemp cord stretched across the water at waist height, anchored to trees on both banks. Adults could hold the rope and cross carefully, but the children needed to be carried. Moses waded in first with Penny and her brother Samuel, one child tucked against each massive shoulder. The current pulled at his legs, trying to knock him off balance, but his weight and strength held firm. The water rose to his chest at the deepest point. The children stayed dry above it, clutching his neck. "Close your eyes if you're scared," he told them. "We'll be across before you can count to 20. On the northern bank, he set them down gently and returned for the next pair. Behind him, adults began crossing hand over hand along the rope line. Daniel first, then Sarah and Lydia, then two more women whose hands gripped the wet hemp with desperate strength. Across the river on the southern bank, movement caught Moses's eye. Hunters, 3 of them on horseback, searching the tree line about 200 yards downstream. They hadn't spotted the crossing yet, but they would if anyone made noise or sudden movement. Moses forced himself to move calmly, naturally. He carried 2 more children across, then 2 more. The river churned around him, and the first fat raindrops began falling, dimpling the water's surface. On the northern bank, Mama Roo had gathered the children into a tight circle. Her voice rose in a low chant. Words Moses didn't fully understand, but felt in his bones. The children's panic settled. Even the youngest stopped crying, their attention caught by the rhythmic cadence of her voice. "Water carries us. Storm protects us. Darkness hides us. Morning finds us free," she sang. The melody wound through the sound of rising wind and approaching thunder. Moses made his final crossing with the last child, a boy named Thomas, who trembled against his shoulder. The hunters had moved closer, searching the bank with methodical attention. Moses could hear their voices now, carried on the wind. "Tracks here," one shouted. "Fresh ones, heading north toward the river." Moses smiled grimly. Those were the decoy tracks he'd laid yesterday, a false trail leading to a crossing point half a mile downstream where the current ran too dangerous for actual use. The hunters would waste hours searching there, while the real crossing went unnoticed. He reached the northern bank and set Thomas down with the others. "Everyone stay with Mama Roo. Daniel will lead you to the cave. I'll be right behind you." But first, he had to erase their presence. Moses waded back across alone, his body now just another piece of the storm-darkened river. On the southern bank, he worked quickly, scattering the footprints, untying the rope from its anchor and coiling it to carry away. He scattered leaves and debris to make the bank look untouched. Thunder cracked overhead, close enough to feel in his chest. The rain intensified, falling in sheets. Moses moved through the woods parallel to the river, heading upstream to where he'd set another trap 2 days ago. A simple design, a net made from woven hemp and fishing line, suspended above a game trail the hunters had been using. The trigger was a thin wire stretched across the path at ankle height, nearly invisible even in daylight. He reached the trap site and climbed into the lower branches of an oak tree to wait. The rain soaked through his shirt, plastered his hair to his skull. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the forest in brief, stark flashes. The hunters came 20 minutes later, following what they thought was Moses's trail. 3 men on foot now, having left their horses behind in the thick undergrowth. They moved in single file along the game trail. The lead hunter's foot caught the wire. The net dropped with a whisper of rope against leaves. It caught all 3 men in its weave. The weighted edges snapping closed around them. The release mechanism Moses had designed yanked the net upward, hauling the trapped hunters off their feet. They dangled 6 feet in the air, suspended upside down, tangled together like fish in a seine. Their cursing was spectacular. Moses dropped from his tree branch and approached slowly, water streaming from his clothes. The hunters struggled against the net, but the more they fought, the tighter it constricted. "Evening, gentlemen," Moses said quietly. The hunters went silent, seeing him for the first time. The giant they'd been hired to catch, standing calm and dripping in the rain. "You can't," one started. "I can let you down in about 2 hours," Moses interrupted, "after I'm far enough away that you won't catch my trail. The net's designed not to hurt you if you stay still. Fight it, and you'll just tire yourselves out. Your choice." He turned and walked away, leaving them hanging, their shouts of outrage swallowed by thunder. Moses made his way back north, crossing the river one final time. The water had risen noticeably, the current stronger. In another hour, it would be impassable. The storm had arrived at exactly the right moment. He found Daniel and the others at the cave entrance, everyone accounted for, the children already settling into the dry shelter with blankets and food. Mama Roo nodded her approval. "Get some rest," she told Moses. "You've earned it." The walk back to the quarters took an hour through driving rain and darkness, broken only by lightning flashes. Moses's legs felt like they were made of wet rope. His shoulders ached from carrying children and fighting current. Every muscle trembled with exhaustion. He reached the quarters near midnight. The storm had everyone inside, doors closed against wind and rain. Moses collapsed in the dirt beside his cabin, too tired to take even the few steps required to reach his sleeping pallet inside. The rain poured over him. Thunder rolled away toward the east. Moses closed his eyes. In the morning, word would spread about the 3 hunters found hanging from a tree, humiliated but unharmed. The legend of the giant of Stillwater would grow larger, more impossible. But right now, in this moment, Moses was just a man, exhausted, soaked, drifting into uneasy sleep with mud against his cheek, and rain washing the day's fear from his skin. Moses woke before dawn to the sound of crying. Not the quiet weeping he'd grown used to, the kind born from exhaustion and fear. This was different, sharper. Panicked whispers moved between cabins like wind through dry grass. He pushed himself upright, every muscle protesting. The rain had stopped hours ago, but his clothes were still damp, his body stiff from sleeping in mud. He stumbled toward the commotion, following the voices to the front of Mama Roo's cabin. A crowd had gathered. Women held their children close. Men stood rigid, fists clenched at their sides. In the center of the group, Lydia was crying, really crying, her shoulders shaking. "What happened?" Moses asked. Mama Roo turned to face him. Her expression stopped his heart. "The colonel came back," she said quietly. "During the night, he brought someone with him." Moses felt the world tilt sideways. Who? But he already knew. Somewhere deep in his chest, he already knew. "Your mother," Mama Roo whispered. "He's been traveling despite the injury. Went all the way to the Pendleton estate in Carolina. Bought her 3 days ago." The words didn't make sense at first. Moses's mother was safe. She was far away on the Pendleton plantation where he'd been born, tending the mistress's garden. living out her final years in relative peace. That had been the one comfort Moses carried, that she was beyond the colonel's reach, beyond all of this. "No," Moses said. The word came out strangled. "No, he wouldn't." "He did." Lydia's voice broke. "She's in the mansion now. She's so small, Moses, so frail. She doesn't understand what's happening." Moses's legs went weak. He staggered sideways, catching himself against the cabin wall. His vision swam. Mama Rue gripped his arm with surprising strength. "Breathe, son. Just breathe." But breathing felt impossible. The air had turned to stone in his lungs. His mother, Evelyn Warwick, 63 years old, barely 5 feet tall, her hands twisted from decades of work. She'd raised him alone after his father was sold south when Moses was 4. She'd taught him to read using stolen newspapers. She'd told him stories about freedom, about dignity, about becoming a man who protected others. And now she was here, trapped in the colonel's mansion, a piece on the board in a game she'd never asked to play. Why? Moses's voice sounded hollow, distant. Why would he do this? "Leverage," Daniel said from somewhere in the crowd. His tone was bitter. "Everyone knows you're the heart of the resistance. Break you, and the rest of us fall apart." Moses closed his eyes. The world spun behind his eyelids. Just before sunrise, the colonel's overseer arrived at the quarters with a written proclamation. He read it aloud while mounted on his horse, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "By order of Colonel Tobias Dayton, the Negro called Moses will surrender himself before noon today. If he fails to comply, the woman Evelyn will receive 10 lashes every hour past the deadline until Moses presents himself for custody. There will be no negotiations. There will be no exception." Moses heard the words from inside Mama Rue's cabin, where Lydia had pulled him to sit down before he collapsed. His hands were shaking. He'd faced dogs, guns, hunters, traps, all without trembling. But this made his entire body quake. "You can't give yourself up," Lydia said desperately. "Moses, please, there has to be another way." But there wasn't. They both knew it. If Moses ran, if he tried to rescue his mother by force, the colonel would kill her immediately. The only thing keeping her alive was the threat she represented, the leverage she provided. "I have to," Moses said quietly. Mama Rue knelt before him. "If you surrender, he'll kill you. You know that. His final hunt he's planning, it's murder disguised as sport." "I know." "Then why?" "Because she's my mother." Moses looked at Mama Rue, his eyes burning. "I spent 30 years watching her suffer, watching her work herself broken so I could eat, watching her teach me to hope when she had none left for herself. I won't let her last days be torture because of me." The sun climbed higher. The morning stretched impossibly long. At 11:30, Moses walked to the mansion alone. The colonel waited on the front veranda, sitting in a chair with his broken leg propped on a cushioned stool. He smiled when he saw Moses approaching. "Punctual," the colonel said. "I appreciate that in property." Moses said nothing. 2 men came forward with iron shackles, wrist cuffs connected by a short chain. They locked them on Moses's wrists with metallic clicks that sounded like finality. "Take him to the barn," the colonel ordered. "String him up properly. I want him to understand his position." They dragged Moses to the horse-breaking barn on the east side of the property. Inside, the space smelled of leather and animal fear. A beam ran across the ceiling, 15 feet up, with a rope and pulley system used for controlling unruly horses during training. The men hauled Moses's shackled wrists upward, using the pulley, lifting his arms above his head until his toes barely touched the ground. His shoulders screamed in protest. The position was designed to cause maximum pain without killing. At least, not quickly. Moses hung there while the colonel entered, leaning on a cane. "Tomorrow at dawn," the colonel announced to the assembled hunters who'd crowded into the barn. "We'll have our final hunt. Moses here will be released. Unarmed, of course. Wounded enough to make it sporting. The first man to bring me his corpse wins $500 in gold." The hunters cheered. Their voices echoed off the barn walls, sharp and hungry. Moses watched them without expression. Pain radiated through his shoulders, down his spine. His wrists had already gone numb from the iron cutting into flesh. The enslaved people who'd gathered outside the barn wept openly. Moses could hear them through the walls. After the hunters dispersed to celebrate their coming fortune, after the colonel left to rest his injured leg, after the crowd thinned and the barn grew quiet, they brought his mother to see him. Evelyn Warwick looked impossibly small. Her gray hair was tied back in a faded cloth. Her dress hung loose on her frame, but her eyes were the same as Moses remembered, sharp, clear, filled with fierce love. "Mama," Moses whispered. She walked to him, moving slowly, and reached up to touch his face with both hands. Her palms felt paper-thin against his cheeks. "My boy," she said softly. "My beautiful, impossible boy. I'm sorry." The words came out broken. "I'm sorry you're here. I tried to keep you safe." "Hush." Evelyn's grip tightened. "You spent your life protecting others. That's nothing to apologize for. They're going to kill me tomorrow. I know. I failed everyone. No." Her voice was iron beneath the gentleness. "You gave them hope. You showed them that fighting back is possible. That's more than most men ever do." Moses's eyes burned. "What good is hope if I die and nothing changes?" Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. "A life can end in chains," she finally said. "But a legacy must not. Do you understand me, Moses? What you started doesn't die with you. It lives in every person you taught to stand straight, every child you carried across that river, every hunter you made look foolish. Mama, you're not just a man anymore. You're an idea, and ideas don't hang from barn rafters. They spread, they grow, they outlive everyone." She kissed his forehead, standing on her toes to reach. Then she was gone, escorted away by guards who wouldn't meet Moses's eyes. Evening fell slowly. The barn darkened by degrees. Through a crack in the wall boards, Moses could see a sliver of sky turning from blue to purple to black. A single piece of moon appeared, thin as a knife blade. Moses hung there in the dim light, arms screaming, wrists bleeding, staring at that moon through the cracked board. His mother's words echoed in his skull. "A life can end in chains, but a legacy must not." The night deepened. The moon climbed higher, that thin silver line visible through the gap in the wood. Moses closed his eyes and tried to remember what freedom felt like. Pre-dawn darkness wrapped around the barn like a shroud. Moses hung suspended in the silence, his body screaming pain through every muscle, every joint, every inch of stretched flesh. The moon had moved across that crack in the boards, vanishing from sight hours ago. Now there was only blackness and the sound of his own labored breathing. He'd stopped feeling his hands sometime around midnight. The iron shackles had cut deep enough that blood had run down his forearms, drying sticky and dark against his skin. His shoulders had gone beyond pain into a strange numbness that felt almost worse, like his body was giving up piece by piece, but his mind remained clear, sharp, focused on his mother's words. A life can end in chains, but a legacy must not. Moses opened his cracked lips and whispered into the darkness, "Mama, I promise you, I promise I won't let them break what we've built. I won't let your last sight be my defeat." The words came out hoarse, barely audible, but speaking them made them real, made them a vow. He didn't know if she could hear him across the plantation yard. Didn't matter. The promise was for himself, as much as for her. A sound broke through the silence. Footsteps, multiple sets, moving carefully. Trying to stay quiet, but not quite managing it. Moses's eyes snapped open. His first thought was that the colonel had sent men to beat him before the hunt, to soften him up even further. But then he heard Lydia's voice, hushed and urgent. "The door's barred from outside. We need something to pry. Here." That was Daniel. This iron rod should work. Moses's heart stuttered. They'd come. His people had come. "Careful," Mama Roo whispered. "Make too much noise, and we'll have every guard on this property running our direction." "Then we work fast," Saul said. The young man's voice was tight with fear, but steady with determination. Moses heard them moving around the barn's exterior. Metal scraped against wood. Someone grunted with effort. The lower hinge of the barn door groaned as pressure was applied. "It's giving," Daniel said. "Keep pulling." Moses tried to speak, tried to call out, but his throat was too dry. He managed only a rough sound somewhere between a cough and a word. The barn door shuddered. The lower hinge broke free with a sharp crack that echoed across the yard. Everyone froze. Silence stretched for 10 heartbeats, 20, 30. No guards came running. No voices raised in alarm. "Move," Lydia said. They slipped inside through the damaged door, carrying a single covered lantern that cast barely enough light to see by. Moses blinked against even that faint glow, after hours in total darkness. Lydia reached him first. Her hand touched his face, and she made a small sound of horror when she felt how cold his skin had become. "Moses! Oh, God! Moses!" "I'm here," he rasped. "Still here." Daniel was already climbing. He'd brought a ladder, stolen from somewhere, carried quietly across the yard, and positioned it beneath the beam. He scaled it quickly, his carpenter's hands sure and steady even in dim light. "Hold on," Daniel said. "Just hold on a little longer." Moses felt Daniel's fingers working at the knots holding the rope to the pulley system. The man worked fast, testing each strand, finding the quickest way to release the tension without dropping Moses straight to the ground. "Saul, get under him," Daniel ordered. "When I release this, he's going to fall. We need to ease him down." The young man positioned himself directly beneath Moses's suspended body. Two other men Moses couldn't quite see in the darkness moved in beside Saul, ready to catch. "Now," Daniel said. The rope released. Moses dropped, not far, maybe 2 feet before hands caught him, arms wrapped around his torso, lowering him the rest of the way with surprising gentleness. His feet touched the ground, and his legs immediately buckled. He had no strength left to stand. They eased him down to sitting. Lydia knelt beside him, working at the wrist shackles with a thin piece of metal she'd brought for the purpose. Her hands shook, but her focus never wavered. "Where's Mama?" Moses managed to ask. His voice sounded like gravel scraping against stone. "Safe," Mama Roo said, kneeling on his other side. "Hidden in my hut with 2 women watching over her. The colonel's men won't look there. They think she's still locked in the mansion basement." The shackles came free. Moses's wrists were raw meat, the skin torn and bleeding. Lydia immediately wrapped them with strips of cloth torn from her dress, binding them tight. "Can you stand?" Daniel asked. Moses tried. His legs shook violently. Pain shot through his shoulders, so intense it made his vision white out for a moment. But with Daniel and Saul supporting him on either side, he managed to rise. Barely. "We don't have much time," Daniel said. "Sun's coming soon. The colonel will send men to prepare you for the hunt within the hour." Moses nodded. Speech still felt beyond him, but he understood. They needed to move, needed to get him hidden, get him strong enough to fight. Mama Roo pressed a flask to his lips. "Drink. It's water mixed with herbs for strength. You need to get your body working again." Moses drank. The liquid burned going down his damaged throat, but warmth spread through his chest, his stomach. Not healing, not yet, but enough to clear his head a little more. They helped him from the barn, moving through shadows, staying low. The plantation was still mostly asleep. A few lights burned in the mansion windows, but the quarters remained dark and quiet. They brought Moses to Mama Ru's hut, the largest of the slave cabins, positioned near the edge of the quarters. Inside, his mother sat wrapped in blankets, her eyes closed, lips moving in silent prayer. She looked up when Moses entered, supported between Daniel and Saul. Her face broke into an expression of such fierce relief that Moses felt tears sting his eyes for the first time since childhood. "Sit him down," Mama Ru instructed. "We need to work on those shoulders before they stiffen permanent." They lowered Moses onto a pallet. Mama Ru's strong hands began kneading his shoulder muscles, working blood back into the damaged tissue. Moses gritted his teeth against the pain, but didn't cry out. Outside, through the thin cabin walls, he could hear people moving, quiet footsteps, whispered instructions. The community was mobilizing. Lydia leaned close to Moses's ear. "We're setting traps. Everything you taught us these past weeks, we're using it all. The paths the Colonel's hunters will take, the gates they'll ride through, the horses they'll mount. We're making this plantation into a maze designed to destroy them." Moses met her eyes, found his voice again, stronger this time. "Don't kill anyone unless you must. We're not murderers." "We know," she said, "but we're not prey anymore either." Daniel appeared in the doorway. "Saul's crew is laying rope snares along the eastern path. The Thompson brothers are rigging the stable gates to jam when opened from outside. Clara and her daughters are mixing up a scent that'll spook the horses, something with crushed peppers and wild onion." Moses nodded. His people, his brilliant, brave, impossible. They'd learned everything he'd taught them, and were putting it into action. Mama Ru finished working his shoulders and moved to his wrists, unwrapping Lydia's cloth bindings to clean the wounds properly. The pain made Moses's breath hiss between his teeth, but he stayed still. His mother reached out and took his hand, the one Mama Ru wasn't working on. Her grip was gentle but firm, real, present. "You're not fighting alone anymore," Evelyn said quietly. "You understand? Whatever comes with sunrise, you're not alone." Moses squeezed her fingers carefully, mindful of her fragile bones. Outside, the sky began to shift from black to deep blue. Dawn was coming. The Colonel's hunt was scheduled for sunrise. The hunters would be waking now, preparing their weapons, saddling their horses. But they didn't know what waited for them. Didn't know that the plantation had transformed overnight into enemy territory. Mama Ru finished bandaging Moses's wrists. She sat back, studying him with those ancient, knowing eyes. "Can you fight?" she asked. Moses flexed his hands. Pain radiated up his arms, but his fingers responded. He rotated his shoulders slowly. They screamed in protest, but they moved. "Yes," he said. "I can fight." The first thin line of dawn appeared on the horizon, visible through the cabin's single window. Orange light spilled across the floorboard. Moses stood slowly, testing his balance. His body protested every movement, but it obeyed. That would have to be enough. He knelt beside the pallet where his mother sat, taking both her hands in his bandaged ones. He kissed her forehead gently, breathing in her familiar scent, wood smoke and garden soil and strength. "I'm ready, Mama," he whispered against her skin. "Whatever comes, I'm ready." The Colonel sat astride his gray stallion at the edge of the eastern clearing, flanked by 12 mounted hunters. His broken leg was splinted and strapped tight, but pain twisted his features despite the laudanum he'd taken before mounting. His rifle rested across his lap, polished and loaded. The first orange rays of sunlight broke through the trees. Birds began their morning calls. The plantation spread out behind him, still mostly quiet, still seemingly under his control. "Bring the prisoner," the Colonel called. 2 overseers walked toward Mama Ru's hut. They expected to find Moses still shackled in the barn. still weak and helpless. Instead, the barn door hung open, the interior empty except for broken rope. Confusion rippled through the mounted hunters. Then Moses emerged from the quarters. He walked slowly, steadily, his massive frame backlit by the rising sun. His wrists were bandaged, his shirt hung in tatters, but he stood straight, towering, impossibly present after a night that should have destroyed him. The colonel's face went white, then red, then purple with rage. "Impossible!" he hissed. "You were chained. You were—" "I'm here," Moses said simply. His voice carried across the clearing despite speaking at normal volume. "Let's finish this." The colonel raised his rifle, aiming at Moses's chest. His hands shook. Whether from pain, rage, or fear was impossible to tell. "The rules are simple," the colonel announced, loud enough for everyone gathered to hear. "The prisoner runs. We hunt. When we catch him, he dies. There is no hour limit. There are no freedoms granted. There is only death." Moses looked at the 12 hunters, looked at their weapons, their horses, their confident faces. Men who'd done this before, men who expected easy sport. He met the colonel's eyes. Then he ran. Not away from them, toward the woods, yes, but along a specific path. A route he'd walked in his mind 100 times these past weeks. A trail that would lead them exactly where he needed them to go. "After him!" the colonel screamed. The hunters spurred their horses forward. Hooves thundered against packed earth. Men shouted with excitement, rifles raised, ready for the kill. The first gate stood 30 yards ahead, the main entrance to the wooded hunting grounds. The hunters charged through it at full gallop. The gate slammed shut behind them. The locking mechanism Daniel had modified earlier triggered perfectly. Iron bars sliding into place with a heavy clang that echoed through the morning air. The gate wouldn't open again without tools and time. 2 hunters in the rear tried to pull back, but their horses were already committed to the charge. They crashed into the closed gate, both men thrown forward, tumbling to the ground with shouts of pain and surprise. The remaining 10 hunters pushed deeper into the woods, following Moses's retreating form. The path narrowed. Tree branches hung low overhead, forcing the riders to duck. One hunter, too focused on his target, caught a branch across the face and was swept from his saddle, landing hard in the underbrush. Moses darted left, then right, using the terrain exactly as he'd planned. Behind him, he heard horses screaming. Clara's scent mixture, peppers and wild onion and something else sharp and chemical, had been spread across the trail ahead. The horses hit the smell and went mad. They reared. They bucked. They spun in circles trying to escape the burning sensation in their nostrils. Riders fought for control. 3 more men hit the ground. Trip lines strung between trees at ankle height caught the dismounted hunters as they tried to pursue on foot. They went down hard, cursing, scrambling to rise. The colonel, still mounted despite his injured leg, pushed forward with 4 remaining riders. His face was twisted with absolute fury. Nothing mattered, except catching Moses. Nothing. They emerged into a wider section of forest. Torches suddenly flared to life on either side of the path, set by enslaved workers positioned in hiding, waiting for exactly this moment. The unexpected light spooked the horses further. 2 more riders lost control, their mounts bolting sideways into the brush. Only the colonel and 2 hunters remained in pursuit now. Moses led them deeper, through a creek that ran higher than expected after recent rains, soaking the horses and slowing them, around a massive fallen oak that required circling, buying more seconds, past a hollow tree where wasps nested, wasps that Daniel had deliberately disturbed an hour before, leaving them angry and aggressive. One hunter's horse passed too close. The wasps swarmed. Horse and rider both screamed, crashing through the underbrush in blind panic. Gone. Now it was just the colonel and 1 remaining hunter, a young man named Pike, who'd hunted these woods his whole life and wasn't easily fooled. Moses deliberately slowed. Let them get closer, close enough to see him clearly through the trees. Then he vanished. Pike pulled his horse to a halt, scanning the forest. Where'd he? Moses dropped from an overhead branch directly onto Pike's horse. The animal shrieked and reared. Pike tumbled backward, hitting the ground so hard the air left his lungs in a single whoosh. He lay there gasping like a landed fish, unable to rise. Moses stepped over him without a second glance. Only the colonel remained now. They were back in the original clearing, the same place where Moses had sprung his snare weeks ago, the same earth where the colonel's leg had snapped, where his humiliation had begun. The colonel dismounted awkwardly, favoring his injured leg. He raised his rifle, aiming at Moses's head from 20 feet away. "End of the line," the colonel said. His voice shook, but his finger found the trigger. He pulled. The rifle clicked. Misfire. The colonel's eyes went wide. He pulled the trigger again. Again. Click. Click. Nothing. Moses had suspected. The plantation's blacksmith, an enslaved man named Joseph, had access to all the weapons, had cleaned them just yesterday, had apparently made certain modifications. The colonel threw the useless rifle aside and drew a pistol from his belt. But Moses was already moving. He crossed the distance in 3 massive strides. His hand closed around the colonel's wrist before the pistol could rise. Moses squeezed. Not hard enough to break bone, but hard enough that the colonel's fingers opened involuntarily, the pistol dropping to the earth. Moses shoved the colonel backward. The older man stumbled, his injured leg unable to support the sudden movement, and fell hard onto his back. Moses stood over him. 7 feet and 3 inches of muscle and determination and righteous fury. The colonel stared up at him, seeing his death approaching. But Moses didn't strike, didn't choke, didn't end it. Instead, he walked to the edge of the clearing where the original snare still lay in pieces. He picked up the largest section of broken iron, the shackle Moses had repurposed into a trap, the same shackle that had snapped the colonel's leg. Moses carried it back, dropped it onto the ground beside the colonel's head. "You don't die today," Moses said quietly. "You face what you've done. You answer for it. Not to me, to law, to witnesses, to truth." The colonel's mouth opened, but no words came out. The sound of hoofbeats approached through the trees. Multiple riders, coming fast. The colonel's face shifted from terror to relief. "My men!" he gasped. "My—" But the riders who emerged into the clearing weren't the colonel's hunters. They wore dark coats, carried official papers, led by a gray-haired man with a marshal's badge visible on his chest. The colonel looked toward them in absolute confusion as they reined their horses to a halt at the clearing's edge. The gray-haired marshal dismounted first, his boots hitting the ground with deliberate authority. 5 other riders followed, forming a loose circle around the colonel, who still lay on his back in the dirt. "Colonel Tobias Dayton?" the marshal asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. The colonel struggled to sit up, wincing as his broken leg shifted beneath him. "I am. And you are trespassing on private property. Leave immediately or—" "United States Marshal Edmund Briggs," the man interrupted. "We're here on authority of federal investigation into reports of illegal activity on this plantation." The colonel's face went from confused to furious in an instant. "Illegal? This is my land. These are my—" "Your property doesn't grant immunity from prosecution," Marshal Briggs said calmly. He withdrew a folded document from his coat. "We've received testimony through established channels, multiple accounts of hunting human beings for sport, torture, murder, practices that violate even the laws of slaveholding states." The colonel looked wildly around the clearing, as if searching for help that wouldn't come. His hunters were scattered through the woods, injured or fled. No one was coming to save him. Moses stepped back, letting the lawmen work. His part in this was finished. He'd planned the resistance, orchestrated the defense, exposed the colonel's cruelty through deliberate strategy. But the justice couldn't come from his hands alone. It had to come from witnesses, from truth spoken aloud where it couldn't be buried. "I demand to speak with," the colonel began. "You'll speak when you're asked to speak," Marshal Briggs said. He nodded to his men. "Secure him." Two riders dismounted and approached the colonel with iron restraints, the same type of restraints that had held Moses in the barn just hours ago, the same type that had bound countless people across this plantation for decades. The colonel's face went white as they locked the shackles around his wrists. "This is outrageous. I am a decorated officer, a respected—" "You're under arrest," the marshal said simply. Movement from the tree line drew everyone's attention. The enslaved community was emerging from hiding, drawn by the sounds of confrontation and the sight of unfamiliar riders. They approached cautiously, uncertain what this new development meant. Daniel came forward first, his broad frame tense and ready. He looked at Moses, who nodded once. Permission, encouragement. "I'll testify," Daniel said, his voice carrying across the clearing. "I'll tell everything. The hunts, the murders, the people who never came back from the woods." Marshal Briggs pulled out a leather notebook. "Your name?" "Daniel Reed. I've been here 7 years, seen 3 hunts myself, know of a dozen more." Lydia stepped forward next, limping slightly from her injured foot. "Lydia Moore. I was hunted 4 nights ago. The colonel himself fired at me. Would have killed me if—" She glanced at Moses. "If I hadn't been helped." More voices joined. Sarah Thompson describing her husband's death during a hunt 2 years prior. Old Turner, weeping, admitting what he'd witnessed but been too terrified to speak about. Young Saul recounting the night he'd hidden in the marsh while dogs tore through the reeds searching for escaped families. The colonel struggled against his restraints. Lies. All lies. These people will say anything to— "I'll testify." The voice came from behind the marshal's group. Dr. Hawthorne emerged from the woods, looking pale and shaken. His medical bag hung from one shoulder, his clothes disheveled from traveling through the forest. The colonel's eyes went wide. "Hawthorne? You wouldn't dare." "I treated the injuries," Dr. Hawthorne said quietly, not meeting the colonel's gaze. "Wounds from hunting accidents, you called them? Broken bones from falls. I knew what they really were." His voice cracked. "I kept records, dates, descriptions, evidence." Marshal Briggs gestured for the doctor to approach. "You'll need to provide those records." "I brought them." Dr. Hawthorne withdrew a wrapped bundle of papers from his bag. "Every treatment, every suspicious death, everything I witnessed, and everything I should have stopped." The colonel sagged in his restraints, the fight draining from him as he realized the scope of what was happening. This wasn't a simple complaint. This was coordinated, planned. His entire world was collapsing around him. "How?" the colonel whispered, looking at Moses. "How did you—" Moses didn't answer. Didn't need to. The truth was simple. Weeks ago, when Moses had first begun organizing escape routes and defense strategies, he'd also sent messages, carried by trusted people through underground networks. Letters describing Stillwater's atrocities in careful detail. Evidence that found its way to abolitionists, to sympathetic officials, to anyone who might listen and act. He'd known his own resistance wouldn't be enough. That breaking the colonel physically wouldn't break the system that enabled him. So Moses had built something larger, a case, a reckoning that came from outside, backed by law and witnesses and undeniable truth. Marshal Briggs looked at the assembled crowd of enslaved people. "The plantation is now under federal investigation. No one here is to be moved, sold, or punished during this period. We'll arrange protection and relocation assistance for any who want it." Mama Roo pushed through the crowd, her ancient frame somehow radiating strength despite her years. She looked at the marshal with clear, steady eyes. "We want North, all of us. We want freedom proper, not promises that might disappear when you ride away." "That can be arranged," Marshal Briggs said. "We have contacts in Pennsylvania, Ohio, places you can start new lives." The colonel was hauled to his feet, still shackled, his injured leg making him stumble. Two of the marshal's men supported him roughly, without gentleness or care. They began walking him toward their horses. "This isn't finished," the colonel spat, twisting to look back at Moses. "You think you've won? You think?" Moses turned his back, walked away. The colonel's words faded into meaningless noise as Moses headed toward the quarters where his mother waited. The community erupted into action. Not chaos, organized, purposeful movement. They'd planned for this possibility, hoped for it, even when hope seemed impossible. Now, it was real. Daniel and Saul began gathering tools and essential supplies. Lydia helped families pack what little they owned. Mama Rue moved through the crowd offering blessings and comfort, her presence steadying those who still feared this might be another cruel trick. Moses found his mother in Mama Rue's hut, sitting calmly despite the commotion outside. Evelyn Warwick looked up at her son with eyes that held profound peace. "It's time, Mama," Moses said softly. "I know, child." She extended her hand. "I've been ready." Moses lifted her gently, cradling her frail body against his massive chest. She weighed almost nothing, worn thin by years of hard labor and harder grief, but she held her head high as Moses carried her outside into the morning light. Wagons were being prepared. The marshal's men had brought 3, and the plantation's own work carts were being loaded with people and possessions. Families climbed aboard, helping each other, making room, organizing themselves with the efficiency of people who'd survived by cooperation. Moses settled his mother in the lead wagon, arranging blankets around her for comfort. She patted his hand. "You did good, son," she whispered. "Better than good. You saved them all." "We saved each other," Moses replied. The final preparations took most of the morning. Supplies loaded, people accounted for, routes planned. The marshal's men would escort them north, providing protection and papers that declared them free people traveling under federal authority. As the wagons began to roll, Moses walked alongside them. He didn't ride, wanted his feet on the ground, wanted to feel each step taking them farther from bondage. Mama Rue sat in the second wagon, her weathered hands raised in blessing over the entire procession. She spoke words in a language older than English, prayers that had survived the Middle Passage and slavery and generations of suffering. Now those prayers blessed a journey toward freedom. Lydia walked beside Moses, her injured foot wrapped but healing. She'd refused to ride in the wagons despite the pain. Said she needed to walk this road herself, needed to feel the distance growing between her and the plantation that had tried to destroy her. "What happens when we get north?" she asked Moses quietly. "We start again," Moses said. "Build something new, something ours. You think it'll be different there? Really different?" Moses considered the question honestly. "I think we'll still face hatred, still face people who see us as less than human. But we'll face it free. We'll face it together. That matters." Lydia nodded slowly. "Together," she repeated. The procession moved steadily north throughout the day. By evening, they'd covered significant distance. By the next morning, they'd crossed into the next county. And the morning after that, they reached the state line. The sun was rising as they crossed, golden light spilling across the road ahead. Moses stood beside the lead wagon, one hand resting on the wooden side where his mother sat, watching the road unfold before them. Behind them lay Stillwater, lay the colonel's arrested rage and the plantation's dismantled power, lay the woods where people had been hunted, and the clearing where Moses had turned predator into prey. Ahead lay uncertainty. Lay the unknown challenges of building new lives in a country that still permitted slavery, still saw them as property rather than people. Lay the hard work of healing from trauma that ran generations deep. But also ahead, lay possibility. Lay communities that would welcome them. Lay land they might own themselves someday. Lay futures they could shape with their own hands and hearts and unbroken spirits. Moses stood tall in the golden morning light, his towering frame casting a long shadow across the road. He was no longer the hunted, no longer prey running through darkness, hoping to survive until dawn. He was the guardian of a new beginning, the protector of families who'd chosen hope over despair, the living proof that even the most brutal systems could be resisted, could be broken, could be left behind. The wagon rolled forward. Moses walked beside it, steady and strong, watching the road stretch ahead toward freedom. I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have handpicked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day.